I had this idea that lit up my heart. And
Mhm.
back then I didn't have that language, but it was like my heart lit up and a window kind of opened for me saying, are you going to jump or are you not? And somehow I knew that if I held back and was like, yeah, but I've never done anything like this. I don't know how to do this. Like, how am I going to do this? And like all those questions, that window would just be like, okay, you know? And so I was like, yes. And I jumped. And from that point forward, it really was this like, this is probably not going to work. But I also knew that it was related to me and the feelings of unworthiness and inadequacy. And like by saying yes to it and just like continuously just pushing it forward, I was saying no to that part of me that just kept saying, you can't do this. You're like, you're not worthy of this. You'll never be able. And part of me was like, I'm not listening to that voice. I'm just going to keep pushing this forward until I get to that point. And I will get to that point where I'm out of steps. I did everything I could and it didn't work, but good for you. You didn't give up. And that was really what the business was going to be. And instead, what happened was it just kept inching forward and inching forward. And I felt the whole time like this imposter. I had no idea what I was doing. And even though it felt like a house of cards that could like just fall at any moment, I would look back and go like, I did a lot of things that I never thought I could do. But then I'd always look forward and go like, oh, but there's that thing. Like I could never do that thing. And then I'd do that thing, right?
Yeah.
But then there was something else. And ultimately, one day, years in, I realized I'm not the same person who started this business. I'm transforming, even though I still feel inadequate and I still feel all those feelings, right? And I was like, this is really interesting. I actually want to talk about this. And how do I talk about this in the context of my consumer products brand, right? And so it was percolating. And that was around the same time that I started meditating, that I had found Dr. Joe. I was meditating, and Dr. Joe has you really work on the life you want to create for yourself, right? And so there was the life I wanted to create for myself, which was kind of ego based, right? It was like, I want this successful scale business that is on the, what was that podcast that was the How I Built This podcast,
Love that
right?
show. Yes. Yeah.
But you know, that to me was like somehow my ego was like, if you can do those things, then you are worthy,
Right.
right? And then there was the part of me, which I now know is more, it's the real part of me, which was like that part of me that asked the question, why did I get this gift? And so I had this desire that was kind of bubbling up to the surface of wanting to share the truth, because people had started, you know, my products were visible.
Yeah.
They were in lots of retail
So
stores.
I just want to talk. So your
Yes.
products, you started with the diaper bag.
Yes.
You had lunch bag, grown up, beautiful lunch bag,
Kids,
sophisticated.
kids to start, and then eventually into adult women's lunch bags
Right.
and backpacks and tote bags. And so it was a lifestyle bag brand. I had visibility in stores like Indigo and Whole Foods and eventually Anthropologie and, you know, many of those like those beautiful specialty stores.
So when
And
you got your first purchase orders from Whole Foods and from Anthropologie, at that point, were you still like, I'm an imposter? I don't even know how to make this happen?
yeah, 100%. Because it's not as it appears,
Of
right?
course.
So
Nothing
people,
in entrepreneurship is ever as it
yeah,
appears, but we just keep selling it because we're really good at selling. That's what we
yeah,
do.
exactly. And, you know, to the whole, back to the whole point of the Dr. Joe, like having him like encourage you to like, you know, really like visualize and create the life that you desire. The business part of my vision, actually, like we had to create these mind movies that we would watch as we meditated at his retreats. And I had these slides where I specifically had a storefront image of Whole Foods, and I had a storefront image of Anthropologie, and I had a storefront image of Indigo. And within a year, I was in all of those stores. But like I said, it's not as it appears. And just being in those stores came with a whole host of other problems, right? And it was like, you know, be careful what you wish for, right? Because you think you want these things, but really, like that's not coming from the heart. That's coming
Mm-hmm.
from the ego, right? And that's different. And then there was the thing that was coming from my heart, which is like I really want to share this story and I don't know how. And then we got knocked off by this big brand, Kate Spade. They knocked off one of our products. And it forced me to ask the question of, as a completely neutral consumer who doesn't know me, doesn't know my story, why would someone look at my product and Kate Spade's product, and aside from take away like the art, the visual, would anyone say like, I prefer what this brand stands for over this one? And there was very, very little that would cause someone to do so, right? And here I was feeling like I have something to share. And I know that people can respond, what would resonate with this whole sense of inadequacy and unworthiness, because it's a universal feeling, even though it feels very individual. And so that's when I made the decision that I know actually where to start this story. And this story starts at the beginning of this divine intervention that I had, and telling the story of my heroin addiction and the story of how I got clean. Right. And so part of me, was like, really? Am I really going to share that story publicly on my children's lunchbox website? But it was like this deep calling. And so I decided to do it. And it took me 6 months to actually launch it. And the one that made me decide that I needed to do this was I belonged to a small mastermind group that met monthly. And we had met for a couple years and we knew, each other quite well. Only one person knew my story and the rest of them didn't. And so I showed up one day and I was like, guys, I have a story to share with you. And I basically shared the entire story and they were just like blown away, right? They were like, what? Like you? But what was even more interesting was the next day I get an email from one of the women in the group. And she asked me to go for lunch. And we were friends, but we weren't like friends outside of the group. And the one thing I knew about her was that she was a young widow and she had lost her husband, and she would refer to, when he was ill. So I assumed that he had died of an illness, and I never asked, and she never offered. And over lunch, we ended up talking about what happened with her husband. And she shared with me the most like heart-wrenching details of this very, very long, drawn out passing of her husband that involved addiction. And I was so blown away because I realized that she was sharing it with me because I'd shared my story, right? And it was such an honor to hold that for someone else, right? Someone I didn't know that well. And that was the first sign for me that I was like, I understand now why sharing this story is important. And so that's what prompted me to go public. And I posted it on my website, and then we shared it on social media, and we got this massive outpouring of support and response. But the thing that was the most meaningful was how people started sharing things that you would never imagine that they would share on social media. And that's when I realized this is so much more meaningful for me and so much more fulfilling than making a sale. And so that's when the divide started in my heart, right?
Between continuing to run your company and
Yes.
a different calling.
Yes. But it was a long and winding path.